Kherson was a remote outpost of the Roman Empire. Situated on the storm-tossed northern edge of the Black Sea, this was truly at the very brink of the civilized world. But in 695, that desolate frontier became the unlikely stage for the return of a fallen emperor. Exiled from Constantinople, Justinian II was a man stripped of everything: his throne, his dignity, and even his nose. More than anything, Justinian had an indomitable spirit. He couldn't get his nose back, but he vowed to retake the throne or die trying. To most, he was a dangerous fugitive, not to be associated with, a disgraced ruler with no future. But to the restless young men of Kherson, eager for adventure and glory beyond the dull monotony of their frontier lives, Justinian's arrival was full of promise. They listened spellbound to the deposed sovereign and to his wild dreams of retaking his throne. Inspired by his determination, several young men, including Baras Bakorios, decided to join him in this risky undertaking. This is the story of Justinian II, a tale that's truly stranger than fiction. To this day, Justinian II is one of the most enigmatic and controversial of the Roman emperors, a man of remarkable contradictions. He's usually dismissed as nothing more than a deranged madman, a psychopath, or a bloodthirsty despot. But is this a fair assessment? What's the truth about Justinian II? Was he a vindictive tyrant, a pious saint, or something in between? In this video, I'll explore the life of Justinian II in an effort to make sense of the man. Let's dive in. In this video, I'll be attempting to provide a balanced portrait of Justinian II to combat the popular narrative that he was nothing but a paranoid psychopath or a bloodthirsty tyrant. Before getting started, a short introduction is in order about our sources. Justinian ruled during the so-called Byzantine Dark Ages, a time when contemporary sources are sparse or non-existent. The earliest surviving Roman accounts about the reign of Justinian II come to us from two men: Saint Nikephoros I, Patriarch of Constantinople, and Saint Theophanes the Confessor. To be clear, Nikephoros and Theophanes are both saints of the Church, and I would never accuse them of lying or of being deliberately misleading. Nevertheless, I don't think we should trust every detail in their chronicles at face value. I'll explain more fully at the end of this video, but for now, suffice it to say that both of them were writing about a century after the events in question. They weren't eyewitnesses to the life and times of Justinian. As a result, when they wrote about him, they were relying on other sources that are no longer available to us, sources that were written by other men who may have harbored a deep hatred for the noseless emperor. Throughout this video, I'll be critically analyzing the works of Saints Nikephoros and Theophanes. Just know that when I take issue with their writings, this should not be taken as criticism of the holy men who wrote them. In other words, any historical errors or propaganda that we identify in these works should be blamed on the integrity of their sources, not on the integrity of these saints. Before examining the life of Justinian II, it's useful to understand how he's typically evaluated. The aforementioned chronicles are overwhelmingly negative in their assessment of Justinian. Many people accept this uncritically, so the mainstream view is that Justinian was nothing but a bloodthirsty, paranoid tyrant. Here's how one history blogger describes Justinian's second reign. By the time he regained his throne, the pain and suffering had unhinged his mind. The international situation had drastically changed during his 10 years in exile, but all he cared about was revenge. As the frontiers collapsed around him, he descended into a bloody reign of terror. The next 6 years were spent killing anyone who looked at him sideways, until the fed-up population overthrew him again, this time cutting off his head to be sure there wasn't a third reign. I'm convinced that this is a caricature with little resemblance to the historical facts. Without further ado, let's talk about the life of Justinian II. In 669, a son was born to Roman Emperor Constantine IV. Breaking with family tradition whereby firstborn sons were named either Heraclius or Constantine, the infant prince would be called Justinian. It was an illustrious name that recalled the glory days of the Roman Empire. Although Constantine could claim no blood relation to Justinian the Great, to him the first Justinian was the embodiment of the imperial ideal. He was the restorer of Rome, the defender of orthodoxy, the great lawgiver, the sleepless emperor. But these weren't the glory days anymore. Things had changed for the worse since the death of Justinian I, and the empire was desperately in need of a new hero. The Roman Empire of the 7th century was facing an unprecedented crisis that began during the reign of Constantine's legendary great-grandfather. The Persians invaded the east, took Jerusalem, and even stole the true cross. At the lowest point in this war, the Roman Empire was truly on the brink of destruction. At this moment of existential crisis, Heraclius went on a daring invasion deep into Persian territory. Despite all odds, he emerged victorious. The triumph of Heraclius over the Persians must have seemed like the beginning of a new golden age for the Roman Empire. In reality, it was only the calm before the storm. Less than 10 years later, Islamic armies burst forth from the Arabian desert. They quickly conquered Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. The tide only began to shift during the reign of Constantine IV, who managed to bring some much-needed stability. Around 672, the Romans inflicted a decisive defeat on the growing caliphate and achieved a temporary peace in the east. Having stabilized the empire's military crisis, Constantine sought to restore orthodoxy to the church. In 680, he called the Sixth Ecumenical Council to defeat monoenergism and monothelitism, a pair of heresies that had divided Christendom for half a century. Constantine was a solid emperor. In a reign of just 16 years, he had halted the Arabs, stopped the empire's bleeding, silenced the heretics, and set the Romans on a path toward recovery. He was still young, and presumably he had many years left to reign. Unfortunately, in 685, Constantine IV suddenly died from dysentery. He was about 33 years old. Thus, in 685, Justinian II ascended the throne. He was only 16 years old, but as far as his personality is concerned, all evidence indicates that he was a young man of considerable self-assurance. Undeniably intelligent and possessed of a genuine interest in affairs of state, young Justinian gave promise of being a dynamic sovereign. And if his youth was against him, it was to be remembered that his father Constantine had also been very young when he succeeded to the throne. Soon after becoming emperor, Justinian took his first wife, a woman by the name of Eudokia. We know almost nothing about her except for the fact that she bore a daughter, and that she quickly disappears from the historical record. She died when she was still quite young, sometime during the emperor's first reign, or in other words, within 10 years of their marriage. When Justinian ascended the throne in 685, the Roman Empire was temporarily at peace with the Arabs on account of their ongoing civil war. In that same year, Abd al-Malik was proclaimed caliph, but he found himself in a weak position and still had to contend with various rivals for power. The lands of the Caucasus were largely independent of Rome or the Arabs, but in recent times they had aligned themselves more closely to the ascendant Islamic caliphate. While the caliph was too busy to intervene, Justinian saw this as a golden opportunity to restore Roman authority. He sent the general Leontius to Armenia. In a series of campaigns, the Romans managed to successfully expand their sphere of influence and enlarge the imperial treasury. This angered the caliph, but there wasn't much he could do to stop it. In 688 or 689, a new peace treaty was ratified, whereby the caliph agreed to even more concessions. Among other things, this treaty entailed that the Caucasus and the island of Cyprus would become neutral territories administered under joint rule. In other words, these territories would not fall under the direct sovereignty of either power. Instead, the emperor and the caliph would share equally in their tax revenue. In Cyprus, this unusual state of affairs remained in effect for over 260 years, providing the island with a measure of local autonomy and relatively stable government. Justinian next focused his attention on the Balkan frontier. In this period, the Romans had a tenuous hold over the region. In particular, Thessalonica was an isolated Roman outpost in the midst of barbarian invaders who had swallowed up the surrounding lands in Thrace. On several occasions in the 7th century, the Thessalonians had endured harrowing sieges, but each time they were delivered by their heavenly patron, Saint Demetrius. From 688 to 689, Justinian successfully led a campaign against the Slavs, and thereby opened the corridor between the imperial capital and the beleaguered city. He then resettled thousands of these defeated Slavs in Anatolia and enlisted them in his armies. At the climax of this expedition, Justinian entered Thessalonica in triumph. This joyous occasion is memorialized in a fresco that was recently uncovered in the Church of St. Demetrius. In the late 19th century, another archaeological find was associated with Justinian's time in Thessalonica. It's the text of an imperial edict carved on a marble tablet, in which the emperor attributes his victory to God and the holy martyr. We are convinced that God, who has crowned us, is always the benevolent champion of our piety and most abundantly grants victories to us. We have come to this city of Thessalonica according to the aid of God, who has crowned us. We have obtained the helpful support of the holy great martyr Demetrius in various wars, which we have made against his and our enemies. So far, Justinian's reign was marked by a decent measure of success. However, this wouldn't last for long. By the early 690s, the tenuous peace between the empire and the caliphate was disintegrating. We aren't exactly sure why this happened, but we do have a few clues. Ever since the fall of Egypt, the Romans had depended on trade with the caliphate for their papyrus. Meanwhile, the caliphate had not yet minted their own coinage, using Roman currency instead. According to a later Arabic source, it seems that Abd al-Malik began to decorate sheets of papyrus with Islamic inscriptions before exporting them to Constantinople. Clearly, this was a slap in the face to the Romans. Around this time, Justinian became the first emperor to issue coins with an image of Christ. Our Lord appears on the front, labeled King of Kings. It isn't clear whether or not these Christ coins were in response to the papyrus issue, or if it contributed to the outbreak of war, but this surely would have enraged the caliph. At the same time, tensions were building over the situation in Cyprus. Many Christians on that island were complaining about harassment from their Muslim neighbors. Justinian responded by relocating many of these Cypriots to a new town in Anatolia, near Cyzicus, called Nea Justinianopolis. Clearly, Justinian was concerned with the safety of his Christian subjects, but from the caliph's point of view, this must have seemed like a flagrant violation of the treaty, for the removal of tax-paying Cypriots would diminish his revenue there. As a side note, the residents of Nea Justinianopolis would be sent back home a few years later, and the new city of Justinian was abandoned. Nevertheless, to this day, the Metropolitan of Cyprus retains the title Archbishop of Nova Justiniana and all Cyprus. The Islamic Civil War was concluded by 692, so the Arabs were once again prepared to renew hostilities against the Romans, and ultimately it was the Muslims who invaded Roman territory, not the other way around. The Arabs claimed that Justinian had violated the treaty. When their armies came storming across the frontier, they carried with them a copy of the broken treaty, like a banner, mounted to the point of a lance. While it isn't totally clear which side was at fault for the breakdown of peace, I put most of the blame on the Arabs. However, as with most wars, the truth is that both sides were likely guilty of provocations. In any case, in 692, Justinian sent an army under the general Leontius to attack these Muslim invaders. The Roman army consisted largely of the Slavic troops that Justinian had relocated and enlisted after his victorious campaign near Thessalonica. When the two armies clashed in battle at Sebastopolis, the Romans initially had the upper hand, but the tide of battle was suddenly changed when 2/3 of the Slavic troops defected to the other side. This resulted in a general rout, and the Romans were decisively defeated. According to Theophanes, when Justinian received news of this defeat, he was furious. In response, he reportedly slaughtered the remaining Slavs and their families who had settled in northwest Anatolia. This is a grave accusation that, if true, exposes Justinian as an evil, bloodthirsty tyrant. But this is almost certainly fake news. According to Nikephoros, who was probably working with the earlier source material, at the Battle of Sebastopolis, all of the Slavs deserted to the Arabs, and there is no word of Justinian's alleged massacre. This account is further confirmed by a much later 11th century source. Secondly, archaeological evidence is contrary to the narrative of wholesale reprisal. In the late 19th century, a lead seal was found bearing Justinian's portrait and an inscription identifying its possessor as an official of the colony of Slavic mercenaries in Bithynia. This dates from 694 or 695, which is at least 2 or 3 years after the alleged massacre. So what's the truth of the matter? At the very least, we can be sure that there wasn't a wholesale extermination as described by Theophanes. Beyond that, it's hard to say. While it's certainly possible that there was some killing, and that Theophanes simply exaggerated the extent of it, I'm of the opinion that this is simply anti-Justinian propaganda. When Leontius returned to Constantinople, he was imprisoned. We aren't sure why, but it was probably for his failure to deliver a victory at Sebastopolis. The Battle of Sebastopolis was, in the grand scheme of things, insignificant. Still, for Justinian, it was a major setback. It would prove to be the major turning point of his first reign. Like his father and his namesake, Justinian II was a pious Orthodox Christian. We've already seen that he was the first to put an image of Christ on his coins. He also cracked down on the heretical sect of Paulicians in eastern Anatolia. But without question, his greatest legacy to the Church was the Council of Trullo, otherwise known as the Quinisext Council. The Fifth and Sixth Ecumenical Councils dealt with theology, but unlike prior ecumenical councils, they didn't issue any disciplinary canons. The Quinisext Council was called to remedy this situation by retroactively supplementing those prior synods with 102 canons. There can be little doubt that Justinian called this council, in part, to emulate the achievements of his namesake and his father. The former had called the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and the latter had called the Sixth Ecumenical Council. The Council of Trullo is still held as authoritative in the Orthodox Church. However, it was never fully accepted by the Roman Catholic Church. This likely stems from the fact that many of the canons contradicted existing Western practices. For example, Canon 13 allows for married priests and criticizes the practice of forced celibacy. Canon 36 states that the Patriarch of Constantinople should have the same rights as that of Rome, be as highly regarded in ecclesiastical matters, and rank second only to Rome in the hierarchy of bishops. But since this is only a restatement of canons promulgated by the Second and the Fourth Ecumenical Councils, it's unclear if this was the reason for Western opposition or if it was something else. In any case, Pope Sergius made it clear that he wouldn't consent to the Quinisext Council. For this opposition, Justinian sent an imperial officer by the name of Zacharias to Italy. He was ordered to arrest Sergius and bring him to Constantinople. However, popular loyalty to the Pope thwarted Justinian's plans. Zacharias managed to reach the papal residence, but when word got out about the impending arrest, the building was surrounded by an angry mob. With the crowd shouting outside, the terrified Zacharias hid himself under the Pope's bed and begged Sergius to have mercy on him. Sergius interceded on his behalf, and the mob allowed him to go in peace. This episode was humiliating for Justinian. It also reveals the young emperor's tendency for heavy-handed solutions, which often blew up in his face and which would prove to be a theme of his reign. Although none of it survives, it's reported that Justinian II sought to emulate his namesake by sponsoring an extensive building program. In particular, he made a series of additions to the Great Palace of Constantinople. He also may have commissioned the golden plaques depicting the 6 ecumenical councils at the Milion, but this isn't clear. To fund these and other projects, Justinian needed to raise money. Like his namesake, he was highly antagonistic with the traditional aristocracy. Since his own interests were in military and religious policy, the emperor seems to have entrusted the details of financial administration to his subordinates. In particular, he employed 2 hated finance ministers, known as Stephen and Theodotus. These men were exceptionally cruel in their methods of extracting tax revenue from the wealthy. Theodotus was said to have suspended some of his victims over fires for slow torture. Furthermore, a number of persons were imprisoned for long terms, a practice not employed by previous emperors. All of this is strangely reminiscent of the behavior of John the Cappadocian in the lead-up to the Nika revolt. It's unclear how complicit Justinian was in these gruesome methods, but in any case it made him and his regime increasingly unpopular, especially with the aristocracy. Roman emperors faced serious consequences whenever they lost a sufficient level of popularity, and Justinian would be no exception. In this tense climate, in 695, the emperor decided to release Leontius from prison. He was appointed to be strategos of Greece. Justinian furnished him with a band of troops and a few ships, and then ordered him to leave Constantinople to assume his new post. According to Nikephoros and Theophanes, Leontius was depressed over this new assignment. Apparently, he thought he was being effectively sent to his death in a dangerous frontier outpost. Just as he was preparing to depart, however, 2 monks arrived at his house. They informed Leontius of a prophecy that he would someday become emperor. This provided the spark that he needed to initiate a revolt. Late one evening, Leontius with a few of his supporters broke into the praetorium and freed the prisoners there. Next, his followers circulated a rumor that Justinian was planning a general massacre of the entire city, beginning with Patriarch Callinicus. This was almost certainly groundless, but apparently the mob bought it. A cry was raised throughout the city, urging the people to convene at Hagia Sophia, where Leontius was proclaimed emperor and crowned by the Patriarch. The people chanted, "Dig up his bones." This was a slogan that signaled popular rejection of an emperor's authority. Soon after this, Justinian was captured and dragged to the Hippodrome, along with his hated finance ministers Theodotus and Stephen. These men would later be dragged through the streets and burned alive. For Justinian, Leontius decided on a more merciful sentence. His life would be spared, but he would be so disfigured that he would never again aspire to the imperial throne. There, before the jeering crowds, they cut off Justinian's nose and the tip of his tongue. Then he was exiled to Kherson. We don't know much about Justinian's early years in exile. It's possible that he lived at a monastery, as this was a common refuge for political outcasts. Among his devoted friends was a certain abbot named Cyrus, who the sources say cared for the humiliated exile. If he did stay at a monastery, Justinian almost certainly didn't take monastic vows. After all, Justinian later remarried and regained his throne. Had he taken formal vows, that would have precluded both. Furthermore, he wasn't a prisoner in the strict sense, as it seems he had considerable freedom of movement. Although his tongue had been mutilated in some fashion, it's clear that this didn't stop him from talking. In fact, he seems to have been unusually talkative in this period. Eventually, he gained a following among the idealistic young men of Kherson, some of whom joined his side and swore to help him regain his throne. Eventually, the local authorities began to feel that Justinian's outspoken boasting was a danger to their city's well-being. Some thought he was so dangerous that he should either be killed or shipped back to Constantinople, where he would certainly be punished as a wannabe usurper. Somehow, Justinian was warned of these plans. In 704, he fled to the north and sought refuge with Busir, Khagan of the Khazars. The Khazars were a mysterious Turkic people who lived north of the Black Sea. Eventually, they would convert to Judaism, but at this time they were still pagans. Busir treated Justinian with imperial honors, and a formal alliance was drawn up between them. As a token of friendship, Busir gave his sister to Justinian as a wife. She was baptized into the Christian faith and received the name Theodora, a name that Justinian undoubtedly selected in honor of the wife of Justinian the Great. There's something touching about all this, as it echoes the first Justinian and Theodora, who had a faithful and lifelong love for each other. The first Theodora was a nobody with a messy past who married a rising prince. By contrast, the new Theodora was a well-to-do princess who married a disfigured exile. We can imagine that initially, she might have had serious misgivings about this unfortunate match. Nevertheless, she learned to love him dearly. In due time, she would venture to save his life at considerable risk to her own. Justinian and Theodora then settled in Phanagoria. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, a new usurper took the throne. His name was Tiberius Absamar. Leontius was deposed, his nose was cut off, and he was confined to a monastery. When Tiberius was informed that Justinian was consulting with the Khazars, he was alarmed. Tiberius sent a number of requests to Busir, offering a reward for the fugitive emperor, dead or alive. At first, the Khagan seemed to ignore these requests, but eventually he decided to betray his brother-in-law, likely motivated by the opportunity to make a cheap buck and to stay on the good side of the reigning emperor. However, one of the Khagan's slaves learned of these plans and informed Theodora. At this crucial moment, Theodora was faced with a fateful decision. On the one hand, she could choose to stay silent. Justinian would surely be killed. By staying loyal to her brother, maybe she would even get a cut of the reward. At the very least, she would finally be free of her bizarre, disfigured husband. Perhaps Theodora could then marry a proper prince. Her other option was to stay loyal to Justinian and inform him of the plot. Although there was nothing in it for her, Theodora demonstrated incredible fidelity and chose to tell her husband. By telling Justinian she not only saved his life, she also saved his dream of returning to the throne. Aware of the plot on his life, Justinian summoned his would-be assassins and strangled them to death. Now he had to flee for his life. But Theodora was pregnant, so she had to stay. Justinian bid farewell to the woman who had saved his life, jumped in a little rowboat, and put out from shore. Justinian was a man on a mission. He was going to retake his throne or die trying. But even a man of Justinian's indomitable spirit must have realized the near hopelessness of the situation. Behind him lay the Khazars, who had proven such unreliable allies. But behind him, too, lay the woman who loved him and who carried his child. Before him lay only the stormy waters of the Black Sea. He was a fugitive with a price on his head and marked by scars that would render disguise almost impossible. Into the dark of the night, Justinian was rowing toward the grim unknown. Keeping close to the shoreline, Justinian skirted his way along the northern coast of the Black Sea until he reached Kherson. By this point, he had been joined by a couple of companions. He didn't go ashore alone lest he be recognized. Instead, he sent one of his men into the town to recruit some more of his former acquaintances. There, he rounded up a small group of volunteers, including Baras Bakorios, his brother Celebus, and 3 other men. From there, Justinian decided to sail along the coast until he reached the land of the Bulgars. As Theophanes recounts, at one point along this journey, a terrible storm arose, so fierce that it seemed as if the small band of outlaws would all drown in the rough sea. One of Justinian's servants was sure that this was a sign of divine wrath. Despairing of their safety, he said, "Behold, master, we are dying. Make a compact with God concerning your safety, that if God restore your sovereignty, you will take vengeance on none of your enemies." To this, Justinian replied, "If I spare any one of them, may God drown me here." Of course, it's impossible to know if there's any historical truth underlying this particular story. If true, it's a vivid glimpse into the vindictive character of Justinian. It's easy to understand why he would desire to exact revenge on his enemies, but it goes without saying that this isn't a Christian attitude. Personally, I'm skeptical that this ever took place because it seems to play right into the narrative that Justinian was obsessed with revenge. Since it's only recorded by Theophanes, I think it should be taken with a large grain of salt. But even if it never happened, it could be argued that this account is at least metaphorically true. As we'll see, Justinian didn't show much in the way of mercy to his defeated foes. Anyways, somehow the little boat finally made it to the mouth of the Danube. From there, Justinian sent one of his men as an envoy to approach Tervel, the Bulgar king. The Bulgars were a pagan people who had recently settled between the Danube River and the Balkan Mountains during the reign of Justinian's father. Tervel willingly received Justinian and his party and agreed to an alliance. According to their agreement, Tervel would help Justinian regain his lost throne. In return, Tervel was promised the hand of Justinian's daughter in marriage. This daughter must have been the child of Justinian's first wife, Eudokia. At the time, her whereabouts were unknown. Justinian probably didn't even know if she was dead or alive, so this is a strange deal. If she was alive, she was quite young, so this could have only been a future promise. In any case, for reasons that are unknown, the marriage never occurred. Tervel would prove to be a much more reliable ally than the Khazars had been. In the spring of 705, Justinian marched toward Constantinople with his new Bulgarian allies. As he was marching south, Justinian passed by a young man tending his family's sheep. His name was Conan, but everyone called him Leo, because he was as brave as a lion. He was clever, too. Although he lived in Thrace, he grew up in Syria, and he knew Arabic. Leo approached Justinian and presented him with 500 sheep as a gift. Impressed, he recruited this young man into his forces and promoted him to aide-de-camp. Leo would accompany Justinian to Constantinople and eventually become emperor himself, but more on him later. Soon the army reached Constantinople. For 3 days, Justinian camped outside the city and tried to convince the people of the capital to open the gates to him. In return, he was mocked and ridiculed. At some point, he uncovered a secret passageway into the city via an underground aqueduct or tunnel. Justinian and a few of his comrades made their way through the dark passage and slipped into Constantinople. Once inside, they fomented a coup against Tiberius, and the emperor fled in dismay. It was said that a disfigured man could not reign as emperor, but Justinian had disproven all the naysayers. His nose would never grow back, however. We aren't sure when he acquired it, but at some point between his exile and his restoration, he fashioned a golden prosthetic nose and fixed it to his face. Back on the throne, he immediately sent a fleet to the distant shores of the Black Sea to reclaim his empress, Theodora the Khazar. As he waited on word from Khazaria, Justinian began to take vengeance on his enemies. You will recall that Leontius was deposed by Tiberius Absamar in 698. He was still alive, but confined to a monastery. Tiberius had fled the capital when Justinian entered it, but he was quickly apprehended by the emperor's men. On February 15, 706, Leontius and Tiberius were dragged to the hippodrome before the jeering crowd. In this great stadium where, 11 years earlier, Justinian had been humiliated and lost his nose, he would have his revenge. The two ex-emperors were forced to crouch before Justinian, who was seated in the imperial box. There they were used as human footstools. During this performance, the audience chanted the appropriate verse from Psalm 91. Thou hast trodden on the asp and the basilisk, the lion and the dragon thou hast trampled underfoot. Following this degrading public display, Leontius and Absamar were removed and beheaded. It goes without saying that murder is always detestable and sinful. I have a special distaste for regicide. It was a common, albeit gruesome, practice for the emperor who seized power through coup or rebellion to kill his predecessor. But this wasn't always the case. Recall that Leontius had shown mercy to Justinian at his fall, and Tiberius had likewise spared the life of Leontius. So Justinian had gone a step further in killing the two of them. I think this is a bad reflection on his character, but we should remember that Justinian's return was itself proof that Leontius or Tiberius, if allowed to live, could present a future threat. While I don't seek to justify the regicides, it's certainly understandable why Justinian decided to take this action. In any case, if Justinian had stopped at the execution of his predecessors, I would have more sympathy for him. The problem is his reprisals went further. Leontius and Tiberius were by no means the only victims of Justinian's purge. Absamar's brother, Heraclius, who was a general, was also killed, as were a number of other high-ranking officials and nobles. It's impossible to know the full extent of this purge, and the chronicles probably exaggerate the extent of it. Nevertheless, Justinian's retribution emerges as an ill-considered and violent reaction, one which robbed the empire of capable leaders who probably would have served him as loyally as they had served his predecessors. Perhaps the worst victim of the purge was Saint Callinicus, Patriarch of Constantinople. If you recall, he had sided with Leontius in his rebellion. Justinian blinded the holy bishop and sent him to exile in Rome. As a replacement, he appointed Cyrus, the abbot who had aided and encouraged him in his years of exile. Shockingly, Justinian spared Theodosius, the son of Tiberius Absamar. The hostile chronicles fail to mention this surprising act of clemency. We only know about it because Theodosius later rose to great prominence as the iconoclastic bishop of Ephesus and confidant of emperors Leo III and Constantine V. We have no idea why Justinian spared him. From his perspective, Theodosius would have been one of the most dangerous men in his empire, so it's truly strange that he survived. Bad as this purge was, it was no reign of terror. Justinian's behavior isn't that of a mad, bloodthirsty tyrant. There's no question that Justinian had moments of vindictive cruelty, and I have no desire to absolve him or to make excuses for his sins. But he clearly wasn't a heartless psychopath who sought to slay all his enemies, real or imagined. He was capable of showing mercy, even if it was only a little. He rewarded his friends and punished his enemies. In short, this purge was neither total, arbitrary, or indiscriminate. While he could be harsh to his adversaries, Justinian was steadfastly loyal to his allies and to those he loved. We've already seen that he rewarded Cyrus with the Patriarchate. Once he was secure on the throne, Justinian was also sure to reward Tervel for his assistance. The emperor bestowed on him and his men a number of valuable gifts, including boxes full of gold, silver, weapons, and silk. Amazingly, Justinian granted Tervel the title of Caesar, next in rank to the emperor himself. He was the first non-Roman prince to receive that honor. As a side note, seeing as how Tervel was granted such a prestigious title, this is a strong indication that he had converted to Christianity. In fact, Tervel is a canonized saint of the Orthodox Church. He was apparently the first Bulgarian ruler to convert to Christianity, and 13 years later he was instrumental in fending off the Arabs at the siege of Constantinople, thereby saving Christendom from the Islamic hordes. Despite the conversion of St. Tervel, the Bulgarian people didn't convert en masse in the early 8th century. They would oscillate between Christianity and paganism until the conversion of St. Boris I in the second half of the 9th century. Justinian's fidelity is most clearly demonstrated by his devotion to his wife. It's likely that the people of Constantinople were disgusted to learn that their emperor had married a barbarian princess. Once back on the throne, it would have been easy for Justinian to repudiate his bride and marry a sophisticated Roman woman. But he didn't. By this point, Justinian hadn't seen Theodora in over a year. He had no way of knowing whether or not she was still alive, or whether she had survived the rigors of childbirth. Eventually, the Roman expedition returned to Constantinople with Theodora and their little son, who had been born in Justinian's absence. The boy's name was Tiberius. This is truly a strange choice of name, considering that Justinian had just overthrown a Tiberius. Modern scholars are perplexed by this decision, but Constance Head suggests a fascinating theory. Maybe the choice was Theodora's. Perhaps she named him after the reigning emperor, Tiberius, hoping that if Justinian failed in his seemingly hopeless mission, Apsamar would have mercy on the boy. But this is pure speculation. Roman-Bulgarian relations in Justinian's second reign are shrouded in mystery and confusion. There was a brief outbreak of hostilities in about 708, but it isn't clear if the Bulgars who Justinian fought were those ruled by Tervel or if it was another clan of Bulgars. I'm inclined to think it was another group, since we know St. Tervel was still allied, or once again allied, with Justinian in 711. Furthermore, only Theophanes records that the Bulgars who Justinian fought were led by Tervel. Since this detail isn't recorded by Nikephoros, it's highly suspect. In any case, whether it was against Tervel or another group, Justinian briefly went to war with some Bulgars. He captured the fortress of Anchialos before he was caught off guard and forced to retreat, barely escaping with his life. A similar lack of success characterized Justinian's dealings with the Arabs in his second reign. Just after Justinian returned to power, Abd al-Malik died and was succeeded by his son, Walid. Justinian did his best to secure the goodwill of the new caliph. It isn't mentioned by the Roman sources, but two independent Arab sources report that Justinian sent supplies and Greek workers to help Walid expand the Prophet's mosque in Medina. This is strange behavior for Justinian, who was otherwise a devout Christian emperor. He almost certainly did this in an effort to promote trade and friendship with the caliphate. Whatever his reasons, if I were him, I know I wouldn't have given a cent to this project. But regardless, this goes against the narrative that Justinian was totally stubborn and imprudent. His efforts to win over the caliph were ultimately unfruitful. Arab raiders continued to plunder Roman territory. In about 709, a large Arab army laid siege to the fortress of Tyana in Cappadocia. Justinian sent relief forces, but they were promptly defeated and dispersed. The failure of this army was attributed to untrained and poorly disciplined Roman troops. However, it's highly likely that Justinian's hasty removal of the military commanders of his predecessors played a significant role. Ultimately, the city fell to the caliphate, and they proceeded to push further into Anatolia over the next several years. Do you remember the young Leo, the sheepherder turned aide-de-camp? Once Justinian was restored to the throne, Leo became an important advisor to the emperor. Through his loyalty, Leo earned Justinian's favor, and he was appointed to prestigious positions. This appears to have incurred the jealousy of his fellow officers, who formed a conspiracy. They charged Leo with plotting against the emperor's life. On hearing this false accusation, Justinian summoned Leo to stand trial. After hearing the evidence, he was pronounced innocent. This glimpse of Justinian's dealings with a suspect is highly significant. He was willing to give the accused a fair trial and acquit him when the evidence was found wanting. This goes against the narrative that Justinian was nothing but a paranoid emperor who disposed of all his enemies, real or imagined. Shortly after this, Justinian appointed Leo to undertake an important diplomatic mission to the Alans, a barbarian tribe north of the Caucasus. Leo's assignment was to enlist Alan mercenaries to invade the neighboring country of the Abiskoi, an area along the eastern coast of the Black Sea. Justinian furnished Leo with a large sum of money for this task, and he was sent out. While on the way, Leo deposited the money for safekeeping at the city of Phasis in modern Georgia. Then he crossed the Caucasus into the land of the Alans. When he reached his destination and was negotiating with the Alans, he was informed of a scandalous rumor. The Alans had been told by the chief of the Abiskoi that Justinian had ordered the withdrawal of the funds at Phasis. According to Theophanes, the rumor was true. But why would Justinian remove these funds and thereby sabotage Leo's mission? For some, there could only be one explanation. The paranoid Emperor Justinian purposely sent Leo on a wild goose chase, and when he was gone, removed the funds. By this duplicitous maneuver, he hoped to get rid of Leo once and for all. This is how Theophanes describes Justinian's motives, and apparently that's what Leo believed too. To him, this must have felt like a betrayal. The emperor who he had served loyally and faithfully had left him out on a limb. What's the truth of the matter? There are two parts to this, the question of the rumor and the question of motives. First of all, is it even true that Justinian withdrew Leo's funds? We can't know for sure, but it's highly suspicious. After all, the source of this rumor was the chief of the enemy tribe, whose land Leo was hiring the mercenaries to invade. Such a person was hardly likely to be a disinterested reporter. It's reasonable to assume that the Abiskoi chief lied in an effort to impair Leo's mission, as that was in his best interest. But let's assume the rumor was true. What were Justinian's motives? Is this proof that he was a paranoid emperor who betrayed his friend? I highly doubt it. This would have been a very strange way to dispose of a potential rival. Surely, if Justinian wanted to get rid of Leo, he could have done it in a more simple and straightforward fashion. We already saw that Justinian previously sided with Leo and acquitted him of the false charges made against him. If Justinian really was worried about Leo, why didn't he just simply side with his accusers and execute the young man? At the end of the day, it's unclear why Justinian withdrew the funds, and I can understand why Leo felt betrayed. But the idea that Justinian, in his paranoia, was trying to dispose of Leo seems absurd to me. In any case, Leo stuck around in Alan territory. Incredibly, he managed to succeed in his mission in spite of the earlier setback. Then, Justinian made an effort to secure Leo's passage back to Constantinople. Was the emperor luring him back to execute him? We don't know, but Leo was suspicious, so he refused to return at this time. It's unclear when exactly Leo returned to Constantinople, but according to Theophanes, Leo returned later during the reign of Justinian. If true, this would seem to undermine the narrative that Justinian was scheming against Leo. After all, the emperor took no action against him. It's clear that Leo was deeply suspicious of Justinian, but the emperor probably didn't harbor any ill will. Leo's deep and abiding hatred for Justinian might seem irrelevant now, but I think it has very significant implications for the legacy of Justinian II. I'll explain more at the end of this video, but for now, just keep that detail in the back of your mind. Let's turn our attention to Italy. Recall that, at the end of Justinian's first reign, he and Pope Sergius came into conflict over the quintessexed canons. Justinian even sent an imperial officer to arrest the pope, but this was violently resisted by the people, and the officer barely escaped with his life. In short, Justinian tried to bully the pope, and it backfired tremendously. It was a humiliating failure for Justinian, and it damaged his relationship with the papacy. But that was his first reign. 10 years had passed, there was a new pope on the throne, and perhaps Justinian had learned some lessons. The new pope was John VII, and he was considerably more timid than Sergius. Justinian asked John to call a local synod to approve of the canons that were agreeable to Rome and to reject the ones that weren't. This was a much more diplomatic approach than Justinian had shown in his first reign. But in spite of the seeming reasonableness of the emperor's message, John sent the tomes back without granting his assent or amending them at all. Pope John died in 707. The next pope was elected, but he only lived for 20 days and was succeeded by Pope Constantine. Constantine seems to have been much more agreeable than his predecessors. Justinian's dealings with Rome and Ravenna were deeply intertwined. These two cities had a long-standing rivalry. The tension between them was rooted in the fact that Ravenna was the political capital of the Exarchate of Italy, but it wasn't the ecclesiastical capital. The Archbishop of Ravenna had to swear obedience to the Pope in Rome. For a few decades, these tensions were mostly dormant, but in 709, Felix was elected as Archbishop of Ravenna. He was intent on asserting his power and independence. Once ordained, Pope Constantine expected him to sign a document that he would promise to do nothing contrary to the unity of the Church or the safety of the empire. Felix boldly refused, and it seems that he was supported by Ravenna's leading men. At this point, Justinian got involved on the side of the Pope. The emperor sent an imperial fleet, intent on teaching that disobedient city a violent lesson. Once the imperial troops arrived in Ravenna, the leading men, including Archbishop Felix, were invited to a banquet. When they arrived, they were arrested and sent back to Constantinople. Then the imperial troops rampaged through the city, pillaging and burning. When the prisoners arrived in Constantinople, they were brought before the emperor. Most of them were executed, but Archbishop Felix was blinded and exiled. As far as I'm concerned, this is one of the worst things that Justinian did in his second reign. It could be argued that Justinian was justified in punishing the disobedient aristocrats, but to unleash an army against the innocent people of Ravenna seems inexcusable. It's possible that the army acted on its own accord without direct orders from Justinian, but either way, the buck stops with the emperor, so he's at least partially to blame for what happened. I have no desire to justify Justinian's behavior, but the million-dollar question is, why did he do this? This question of motives might seem unimportant, but I think it's highly relevant. The way one interprets Justinian's motives will inevitably color their perception of his character. The chronicler Agnellus provides only one potential motive. He reports that Justinian attacked Ravenna because some of the leading men of that city had been complicit in his earlier downfall and mutilation. If true, this would bolster the mainstream portrait of the emperor who is lying awake night after night, crafting vengeful schemes against his enemies. I find this explanation highly suspicious. After all, if the aristocrats of Ravenna were complicit in Justinian's downfall, why did he wait until several years after retaking the throne before exacting his revenge? I think the most likely explanation is the following. Justinian may well have assumed that, by bullying Ravenna into obedience, he would be doing Pope Constantine such a favor that he would be obliged to cooperate more fully on the Quinisext canons. In my view, this explanation makes much more sense of the timing and the historical context. It should be noted that this theory is not mere speculation on my part. It's bolstered by the account in Liber Pontificalis, which strongly suggests that Justinian was primarily concerned to crush the disobedient archbishop and his supporters. Therefore, whatever you think about his actions, and I think they were abysmal, Justinian was not acting out of pure vengeance. His behavior was bad, but his motives were less diabolical. In 711, the Pope visited Constantinople, where he was received with great celebration. At some point, Justinian and Constantine held a conference to discuss the canons. To this day, there is no known copy of the Quinisext canons bearing the Pope's signature, so it's unlikely that the canons were ever accepted in full. It's unclear what exactly took place, but the most plausible explanation is that they hammered out a compromise that was acceptable to both sides. In all likelihood, Pope Constantine approved of most of the canons, but he was allowed to reject those that the West found objectionable. In return, Justinian promised to restore certain ecclesiastical privileges to Rome, specifically over the city of Ravenna. From this interaction, we see that Justinian was apparently capable of reasonable compromise. This conflicts with the mainstream portrait of Justinian as nothing other than a stubborn, heavy-handed despot. By the end of his reign, Justinian's relationship with the papacy was quite strong. The Great Schism of 1054 was still 3 centuries away, but the controversy over the Quinisext canons represents one of the early signs of fissure between East and West. As a testament to these growing tensions, Pope Constantine's visit to Constantinople would be the last time a pope visited the city until Pope Paul VI, over 1,000 years later in 1967. In examining the report of Agnellus that Justinian acted against Ravenna solely out of revenge, we are lucky to have the counter-evidence from the Liber Pontificalis. As gruesome as this was, it's quite clear that Justinian didn't act solely out of an obsession for revenge. However, when it comes to the central event of Justinian's second reign, we only have the negative reports of Nikephoros and Theophanes. The pivotal moment of Justinian's second reign, the one that ended his reign and his life, was the Kherson crisis of 711. Just as with Ravenna, the key to understanding this episode will be an accurate understanding of Justinian's motives. So, what happened? According to Nikephoros and Theophanes, Justinian was furious at the city of Kherson. Years earlier, when he was living there in exile, some of the inhabitants had tried to hand him over to Tiberius. Motivated by pure rage, Justinian sent a massive army to Kherson and the Crimean Bosphorus, under a general named Stephen. He was ordered to slay all the inhabitants and to appoint a new governor named Helius. Before moving on, this narrative is already suspicious for at least 3 reasons. First of all, if Justinian was motivated solely by vengeance, why did he wait more than 5 years after regaining the throne before taking action against Kherson? Even if revenge was part of his calculus, it's hard to believe that was the only motive. The mention of Bosphorus, a city under Khazar control, is an early clue that the expedition was largely directed against the Khagan. As the chroniclers themselves point out, the Khagan had recently set up a governor in Kherson. It's all very unclear, but to me it sounds like the Khersonites were engaged in unauthorized collaboration with the Khazars. In my opinion, this is likely to be the main motive for Justinian's punitive expedition. Regarding the order to slay all the inhabitants of Kherson, this is just absurd. If Kherson was to be wiped off the face of the earth, what need would there be for a new governor? Perhaps this is simply an exaggeration, but if so, it seems like an attempt to paint Justinian in the worst possible light. Anyways, let's continue with the narrative. The imperial troops apparently managed to subjugate Kherson with success. Nikephoros reports that Stephen executed 7 of the leading citizens by roasting, and an unspecified number were drowned. Then a group of 30, including Zoilos, the chief of the citizens, and a Khazar official were shipped to Constantinople along with their families, where they were imprisoned. Theophanes reports that a number of youths were also taken to be sold into slavery. According to the story, Justinian was displeased with the way things were being done, and particularly over the matter of the children who were to be sold into slavery. Therefore, he ordered that the youths be sent to Constantinople at once. His officers in Kherson had no choice but to obey. Despite the stormy October weather, which was not conducive to sea travel, they set sail for Constantinople. At that moment, a terrible storm arose and the whole fleet was destroyed. According to Nikephoros and Theophanes, Justinian received this news with pleasure, but this seems implausible. Even if we suppose that he hated the Khersonites, why would the emperor rejoice in the destruction of his own ships and his own men? In any case, for reasons that are not clear, Justinian still wasn't satisfied with the situation in Kherson. According to Nikephoros, he began making plans to dispatch another fleet against the city. Both chroniclers indicate that Justinian's motive was to exact further vengeance, but they disagree about whether it was sent or not. They also report that the Khersonites sent an appeal to the Khagan for additional aid, and that Khazar troops arrived to help defend the city. More likely than a motive of vengeance, it seems like Kherson was, once again, collaborating with the enemy. At this point, probably thanks to Khazar encouragement, the Roman troops in Kherson, who had arrived as part of the first expedition under the command of Helius, were convinced to throw in their lot with the Khersonites and their Khazar allies. When Justinian heard of this mutiny, he changed his plans. The emperor released Zoilos and the Khazar official and sent them back to Kherson with a small force of about 300 men. There they were to attempt to restore the status quo as far as possible and convey Justinian's apologies to the Khagan. Helius was to be arrested and sent back to Constantinople. This attempt to restore order came too late. The Khersonites at first refused to deal with the envoys. Then, pretending to change their attitude, they invited Justinian's men into the city and put to death the leaders. The remainder were seized and sent off to Khazaria, along with Zoilos and the Khazar official. For the rebels at Kherson, they acclaimed a new emperor by the name of Vardan. Vardan was a Roman officer of Armenian origins who had joined Helius on the first expedition. Vardan assumed the more Roman name of Philippicus. When Justinian heard of this rebellion, he allegedly took out his anger on the family of Helius, who were then living in Constantinople. We can't know whether or not this is true. While Justinian wasn't a cartoon villain, we've seen that he did have a fiery temper, and he wasn't above taking out his wrath on innocents, so I don't discount it completely. Anyways, Justinian proceeded to send another fleet to Kherson. These imperial troops arrived and set up a siege. As for Philippicus, he had fled Kherson and taken refuge at the court of the Khagan. Just when the situation was looking desperate for the rebels, further aid arrived from the Khazars. Justinian's forces, not wanting to return to Constantinople in disgrace, switched their allegiance to Philippicus. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, when Justinian received no news from Kherson, he made the mistake of leaving the capital to suppress a rebellion in Armenia. With Justinian gone and his troops having defected in Kherson, Philippicus left the Khazar court, rejoined the fleet at Kherson, and sailed straight for Constantinople. By the time Justinian learned of this, it was too late. Philippicus secured the capital without a fight. Justinian turned back toward Constantinople, but he was overtaken by a band of rebel soldiers under the command of Helios. They carried an offer of general amnesty from Philippicus for all who would desert the noseless emperor. Only a few of Justinian's officers remained loyal to the death. One of them was Baras Pacorios, a man who was one of Justinian's early Chersonite followers. He was tracked down and executed. On November 4th, 711, Justinian II was beheaded. He was 42 years old. His headless corpse was thrown into the sea, and his head was sent around the empire. Understandably, the people of Ravenna celebrated when the emperor's head visited their city, but in Rome, many mourned his fall. The author of the Liber Pontificalis wrote sorrowfully of the melancholy tidings that Justinian, the most Christian and Orthodox emperor, was murdered. While Justinian had spared the son of Tiberius, it's tragic to note that Philippicus did not spare the life of Justinian's young son. When Justinian's mother, Anastasia, received news of her son's death, she took her 6-year-old grandson to the Church of the Virgin of Blachernae, where she hoped they might find sanctuary. 2 agents of Philippicus entered the church. Anastasia pleaded through tears that they spare the life of the boy. Young Tiberius clung to the altar with one hand, and in the other he held fast to some fragments of the true cross. One of the agents stripped him of these relics, carried Tiberius outside, and slaughtered him on the spot. Thus ended the Heraclian dynasty. We don't have any idea what happened to Theodora, that faithful empress. She simply disappears from history. To summarize what I said at the beginning of this video, the earliest surviving records about Justinian II come to us from Saints Nikephoros and Theophanes, and these are overwhelmingly negative in their assessment of the noseless emperor. The problem is, Nikephoros and Theophanes were writing 100 years after the events in question. Since they were born long after the death of Justinian, they were probably just repeating information from hostile sources that are now lost to us. I would never question the integrity of Nikephoros or Theophanes, but I don't take everything in their chronicles at face value because I seriously doubt the integrity of their sources. So, why might their sources be suspect? Scholars generally believe that Nikephoros' source is probably earlier and more reliable, written around 713 after the deposition of Philippicus, Justinian's immediate successor. The chronographia of Theophanes is more detailed but also much more salacious. For example, Theophanes is our sole source for the alleged massacre of Slavs. As we saw, this story is nowhere present in Nikephoros' account, which suggests he was using different source material. He was probably drawing on a source that was written during the reign of Leo III. If you recall, Justinian started and supported Leo's political career, and even saved his life when he was falsely accused by some jealous colleagues. Nevertheless, Leo became convinced that Justinian wanted to have him killed, or at least to dispose of him in some way. Despite the emperor's goodwill toward him, Leo developed a deep hatred for Justinian. Leo eventually became emperor himself, and he had plenty of motive to damage the memory of his former patron. But there's another possible motive too. Although he lived before the iconoclast controversy, Justinian was clearly an iconodule. Of course, he famously put an icon of Christ on his coins. Not to mention, Canon 82 of the Quinisext Council explicitly calls for images of Christ. Of course, Leo was an iconoclast heretic. Therefore, he may have wanted to slander Justinian in an effort to strike a blow against his theological enemies. Lastly, at least once during Leo's reign, a pretender arose who claimed to be a son of Justinian's. As Constance Head observes, Leo may well have felt that anti-Justinian propaganda was a helpful measure in squelching the aspirations of anyone who might claim the throne as the fallen monarch's heir. Nikephoros' account, although negative, is less harsh than Theophanes' account. This supports the thesis that St. Theophanes was relying on a strongly biased source from the reign of Leo III. Thus, on account of this propaganda, it would appear that something of a black legend developed about Justinian II after his death. I maintain that the accounts about Justinian are based on sources that are heavily biased and ultimately untrustworthy. Having said that, I don't think we should dismiss everything that Theophanes and Nikephoros say. There's no question that their negative sources were based on a kernel of truth. Justinian was far from perfect. He possessed a hot temper, he had moments of cruelty, he was impulsive, and his decisions were often unwise. As Constance Head says, the reinterpreter must also beware of the peril of whitewashing Justinian's mistakes. Although he was a ruler of considerable ability and intelligence, and most richly endowed with the gift of courageous persistence, he was sorely lacking in the level-headed patience and forbearance that he would have had to possess to have earned a place among Byzantium's truly great and successful emperors. So what's the truth about Justinian II? From an administrative point of view, Justinian wasn't incompetent, but he certainly wasn't a great emperor like his namesake. Sure, Justinian can be credited with a few good accomplishments, like his campaign against the Slavs, but his tenure was also marked by major military defeats. His decision to appoint 2 wicked finance ministers was short-sighted, and it damaged his popularity. Although I think his deposition in 695 was tragic and unjust, I can understand why he lost the throne. From a moral point of view, we've seen that Justinian was a flawed individual. The most extraordinary thing about Justinian was his sheer tenacity. In a remarkable series of events, he overcame all odds to retake his throne after a period of 10 years in exile. But of course, ambition is a two-edged sword. It could be argued that Justinian would have been better off had he remained in Kherson, taken monastic vows, and lived the rest of his life in prayer and contemplation. At times, he could be vicious and unforgiving. After the Battle of Sebastopol, he imprisoned Leontius. If this was for his failure to deliver a victory, then it seems like an unjust punishment, and I can understand how this would have alienated potential supporters. Worse, when he retook the throne in 705, he lacked the mercy of his predecessors. Leontius and Tiberius were killed, along with many of their associates. Worst of all, he blinded and exiled St. Callinicus the Patriarch. Justinian's cruelty was also on full display against the city of Ravenna. His second reign was characterized by more violence than his first reign. Perhaps this can be explained in part by the change wrought on him by his disfigurement. But even in his first reign, Justinian displayed a propensity for heavy-handed tactics, like when he attempted to bully Pope Sergius into submission over the Quinisext canons. On the other hand, Justinian displayed a number of virtues. He was always a pious Orthodox Christian. He protected the Christians of Cyprus. He cracked down on heresy. He put an image of Christ on his coins, and he called the Quinisext Council. Justinian was faithful to those who he cared for, not least of whom his wife Theodora. It seems that his love for her was genuine and mutual, as evidenced by the fact that she saved his life at a crucial moment. If Justinian was just an unlovable brute, it's hard to see why Theodora would have saved him at his lowest point. She could have easily disposed of her mutilated fugitive of a husband if she wanted to. Later, Justinian returned the favor. Instead of trading her in for a proper Roman wife, he made the unpopular decision to keep his Khazar empress. This same loyalty was evident in how Justinian treated his friends. Upon retaking the throne, Justinian rewarded his steadfast comrades and appointed them to prestigious positions. Some of these companions, like Boraspakorios, would be faithful to the death. This is difficult to explain if Justinian was simply an unlovable jerk with no redeeming qualities. To be sure, it's not a great mark of one's moral character if he is only good to those who love him. As our Lord says, the measure of a good man is how he treats his enemies. After all, even the worst people tend to love those who love them, like their brothers and their friends. However, while Justinian certainly had a brutal streak, and he wasn't always merciful when he should have been, we've seen that he was capable of showing compassion to his enemies. When he regained his throne, he spared the son of Tiberius, a surprising act of clemency. When Leo was brought up on false charges of conspiracy, Justinian declared him innocent. This isn't the behavior of a paranoid, bloody psychopath. And while Justinian's relations with the papacy in his first reign were rather heavy-handed, he displayed much more compromise in his second reign. When it comes to the worst accusations against Justinian, These are either pure slander, or if they really happened, his motives are distorted in the most uncharitable way. For example, the alleged massacre of Slavs is almost certainly just fake news. The attack against Ravenna did happen, and it was terrible. We can't know to what extent Justinian ordered or allowed these abuses, but he certainly deserves the majority of the blame for that incident. In any case, he wasn't simply motivated by revenge. Regarding the Kherson crisis, his motives are less clear, but here again it doesn't seem to be revenge. Rather, it seems like he was retaliating against a rebellion that was being fomented by the Khazars. The idea that Justinian was simply obsessed with revenge is a false caricature. Clearly, Justinian wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a cartoon villain either. In short, Justinian II was a complicated man. It's really difficult to evaluate him because he simultaneously committed terrible sins and also displayed some great virtues. He was a man of deep contradictions. But aren't we all? At the end of the day, I think we can all see ourselves in Justinian II. In him, I see the sad condition of our fallen human nature, the daily struggle we all face in trying to do the right thing. People who are otherwise morally upright can do terrible things. On the other hand, bad people are often capable of surprising goodness. In this sense, I have a lot of sympathy for the noseless emperor. I made this video to provide a balanced perspective on Justinian II, and I hope I've accomplished that here. As an emperor, Justinian is fascinating enough in his own right. I really think he deserves a Netflix series or a movie or something like that. But before closing out, I need to address one of the most intriguing things about Justinian's legacy, which I have thus far ignored. Is Justinian II a saint? One of my main motivations for doing this research was to examine precisely that question. As it turns out, there are some lists of saints that include Justinian on August 2nd, but his status is controversial. So what's the truth here? In answering this question, we need to make a distinction between saints and canonized saints. It could very well be the case that Justinian II is in heaven. If so, then by definition, he's a saint. I hope for his sake that he is, just as I hope that everybody is a saint. But of course, it goes without saying that I can't make a determination on that question. That judgment is well above my pay grade. So to be more specific, the relevant question here is whether or not he's a canonized saint. A canonized saint is somebody who the church has officially recognized as a model Christian, a person who is definitely in heaven, somebody we can pray to and venerate as a holy example. As I've mentioned elsewhere on this channel, the Orthodox Church doesn't have a single authoritative, fully comprehensive list of canonized saints. Most saints are uncontroversial and universally recognized, like St. Nicholas and St. George. But there are some who seem to exist in a gray area. It would appear that Justinian II falls into that category. Based on my research, there was a time when Justinian II appeared in some lists of saints. However, this was never universally recognized, and it seems that most lists no longer include him. When it comes to the church, I'm a firm believer in reception theory. Reception theory refers to the idea that a decision of the church, for example, an ecumenical council, is only considered truly binding and authoritative once it has been received and accepted by the wider body of the church across time and place, which signifies a consensus. Essentially, the church as a whole must embrace and implement the council's rulings for them to be considered definitive. For example, after the Council of Nicaea in 325, the Arian crisis didn't just go away. To many people living at the time, especially the Arians who were dominant in the eastern part of the church, Nicaea wouldn't have seemed like the last word. But in time, the church received Nicaea as the truth. This reception is fundamentally what distinguishes false councils from ecumenical councils. In the same way, if an individual hasn't always and universally been recognized as a saint, has the church truly received him as a canonized saint? I don't think so. On this basis, I can't comfortably say Justinian II is a canonized saint. At this point, some may object and point out that there are plenty of local saints who aren't known or venerated everywhere. This is true, but Justinian II doesn't simply lack universal veneration. He's also very controversial within the church. According to St. Nicodemus the Hagiorite, Emperor Justinian II was a bad man who lived a bad life, and he could not imagine that he would be commemorated as a saint, since in the Synaxarion of St. Callinicos of Constantinople on August 23rd, it does not say he died in repentance. Despite his flaws, my opinion of Justinian II is slightly more positive than that, but in fairness, I'm not aware of any evidence that he repented before the end. As Orthodox Christians, we can't simply dismiss the suspicions of St. Nicodemus. In other words, the doubts of Nicodemus should be seen as a red flag to anyone who would try to say Justinian II is a canonized saint. Recall also that the negative accounts we have about the life of Justinian come to us from two saints. As I've argued, Nikephoros and Theophanes were working with biased sources. It's reasonable to assume that St. Nicodemus was reading these same negative accounts when he made his assessment of Justinian. In other words, Nicodemus, Nikephoros, and Theophanes may have uncritically bought into the black legend. Nevertheless, there are at least 3 saints who dispute the status of Justinian II, so it's clear that he's controversial to say the least. For these reasons, I hesitate to call Justinian II a saint, because he's too controversial and his canonization status is murky at best. That still leaves us with one last question. Justinian II was at one time recognized by some as a saint. Why is this? I think there are at least 3 possible explanations. Some lists of saints that include a Justinian on August 2nd do not have any reference to indicate whether it is Justinian I or Justinian II. Therefore, some have speculated that this Justinian is referring instead to Saint Justinian the Great, who is also commemorated with Saint Theodora on November 15th. Perhaps this is the case. However, I have a couple theories of my own. If you watched my video on Saint Justinian the Great, you know that he is clearly a canonized saint. Nevertheless, a historian by the name of Evagrius invented the slanderous lie that the sleepless emperor died in heresy. Sadly, this lie has been perpetuated down the centuries, and even many well-meaning Orthodox Christians have accepted it as true. The result has been something of a dual tradition regarding Justinian the Great. Perhaps at some point in the distant past, a certain scribe turned Saint Justinian into Saint Justinian II. In other words, due to this false rumor of heresy, someone assumed that Justinian I couldn't possibly be a saint, and substituted in his place Justinian II, a man who, despite his flaws, was undoubtedly orthodox. The third possibility is that Justinian II made his way into some lists because of the Quinisext Council. I think there's an assumption on the part of some Orthodox Christians that every emperor who called an ecumenical council must be a saint. In general, this has been the trend. After all, St. Constantine called the first council, St. Theodosius called the second council, and St. Theodosius II called the third council, and so on. In fact, every prior ecumenical council was called by a saint. While Trullo isn't an ecumenical council per se, it does carry the weight of an ecumenical council in the Orthodox Church. Perhaps an overzealous hagiographer included Justinian II out of precedent. That concludes my video about Justinian II. If you enjoyed it, please drop a like and subscribe, and please share this video with anyone you know who might enjoy this sort of content. With that, I'll see you guys next time.